Hey guys, and welcome back to Group Therapy. I'm one of your hosts, licensed clinical social worker, Kristen Gingrich.
And I'm licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Kristen Casey.
I'm licensed psychologist, Dr. Jessica Rabon.
And I'm licensed psychologist, Dr. J.
This week, we are breaking down antisocial personality disorder. So settle in, take a seat, and welcome to Group Therapy. But first, let's rewind to last week where we talked all about nightmares and dreams. So last week, our reflection question is, what is the strangest or funniest dream you remember having? And we did hear some funny dreams from just us, but we want to hear from you. So let's see.
Can't wait.
What do we have in the comments section? Watching my head spin around in the microwave. Could you imagine?
We need Jessie back.
You're
Jessie,
watching it.
Ooh.
Someone said, I was late to school and rode on top of a desk all the way to my homeroom. That's so Raven style.
That's kind of badass.
When I was 12, Morgan Freeman 100% tried to kill me, so I beat on his head with a tennis racket while he screamed in my face like an alarm clock. I didn't even know who he was at the time. Just a few weeks later, watching a movie and then seeing the man who attempted to murder me. Great times.
So vivid.
Yeah. Hiding in my old high school from a giant T-Rex, got stuck in a stairwell, then decided I needed to escape. So I got outside and hid under a mushroom, using it like an umbrella. I knew I had to get to a convenience store because I remember seeing the door. Hiding from T-Rexes is a reoccurring theme.
That person is so resourceful.
I feel like a Mario theme in there.
Yeah.
I did too. I felt that a bit too. Yeah, a little bit of a power up maybe.
I was in a canoe floating down a river in the rainforest, and I had a pet chicken. Everyone else wanted to eat her, so they encased her in hot glue. She was fine. Then it shifted to me running across a football field with my chicken, because a giant football player wanted to eat my chicken. I woke up before he could reach me.
Those are amazing.
Oh, man. So those were some dreams.
They were.
They were.
They were something. But I do, before we dive in today, I do want to just take a moment and reflect on the last week. So as a lot of you know, I am from Maine. We had a mass shooting here in Maine that really rocked our state to the core. And so I just want to send out to any of our listeners from Maine or New England, I just want to send out that I see you and I'm feeling with you. And we will heal together.
Love you.
And thank you guys. And I want to send out a big thank you to my co-hosts who were just simply amazing over the last week in just being supportive and listening to my very long voice memos. I love you guys.
We love you too.
Glad you're safe, and been thinking of you. So.
But this week, we are going to break down antisocial personality disorder. And so a question that I have is, has anybody worked with anyone with antisocial personality disorder or have any direct experience? Because I don't.
I've never worked with antisocial personality disorder. Part of that is I work with children, and it's not diagnosed till 18, but I definitely feel like it's seen more in forensic type settings, like prisons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say very limited. Reflecting before this episode, I was thinking of one, and it was very short-lived. And then other clients where maybe, I know a lot of times this gets discussed as far as traits, but as far as full-blown of what we're going to get into, and meeting criteria for the disorder, no. Yeah.
I would agree with that. I've seen a lot of traits, working in community mental health. And I've worked with a lot of kiddos, who have things like conduct disorders, but never working one-on-one with a person who was diagnosable antisocial.
Yeah.
I feel like I have really limited experience too. I worked in forensics for a really short stint, and then I also worked inpatient for a long time, but it was rare that we kind of saw it in there too. And I think maybe the setting matters, because I think people with antisocial don't really like volunteer to go to therapy usually.
Right.
So I think it's just limited for most people unless like you specialize in forensics. So I worked, in forensics just doing evaluations though. I never did treatment. So I don't really know what it would feel like to be a clinician, but as an evaluator, I've evaluated it. And I do have a family member, a couple of family members with the diagnosis as well. So on the personal end, I know what it might be like to know someone, with it, or just to interact with them outside of the clinical setting. But as a therapist, I don't think I've ever worked, with somebody with antisocial.
So what is antisocial? Because I feel like there is, I think, what people think it is when they hear the term antisocial and what it actually is. Because, you guys know how hot topic I was when we talked about intrusive versus impulsive thoughts. I have pretty much the same reaction when I hear someone say, I have antisocial personality disorder. And I'm like,
or I'm antisocial.
Or I'm antisocial,
Yeah. Well, I have my DSM-5 TR pulled up so I can go through the
Of course you do. Tell us, Jess. Tell us.
criteria. No, but I think it's a good place to start so we know what we're talking about. So
Absolutely.
when going through the criteria, so criterion A, a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others occurring since age 15 years as indicated by 3 or more of the following. So 1, failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. 2, deceitfulness as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. 3, impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. 4, irritability and aggressiveness as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults. 5, reckless disregard for safety of self or others. 6, consistent in responsibility as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. And 7, lack of remorse as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another. And then the other criterion B, the individual is at least 18 years. C, there is evidence of conduct disorder with onset before age 15 years. And D, the occurrence of antisocial behavior is not exclusively during the course of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder.
Beautiful.
Glad I honestly was worried that I was going to come across a word I didn't know how to pronounce.
A work of art. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, what are your initial thoughts when you all hear those criteria?
I think the first thing, it shines light on what we all alluded to, and we actually talked about this before we started recording, is on its surface, when you go through these criteria, you can kind of understand why you don't necessarily have a lot of people with antisocial personality disorder waltzing into therapy. Where many others, it's sort of self-explanatory. You're suffering from flashbacks like PTSD, or you have this worry that plagues your mind, or you're in these depressive lows where it's just hard to, it's like when you read all these things and like some other personality disorders, it's just rare you have someone coming in saying, I don't have regard for other people, or I'm constantly feeling like these laws and everything are like bullshit. And it's like, I think where you would see this is what we alluded to, is more mandated therapy in forensics, or tied to something else, which we know, co-occurring diagnosis, substance abuse, bipolar disorder, and anxiety and depression, which you could kind of argue are co-occurring with most things. But you see a lot with substance abuse and bipolar for sure.
Yeah, I think to KPI's point before, as I'm reading the DSM, I just think being introverted or having a preference or tendency for not wanting to be around people, or feeling like people annoy me, or you get irritable around other people, or you have a tendency to feel a sense of anger maybe towards other people. It's different than a blatant lack of regard for their safety, their bodily experiences, and even just the ability to empathize with other people. And I think that's probably why a lot of people with antisocial and my forensic psychologist friends might disagree with me, or they might agree with me. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert. But that's probably the reason why they can't go to therapy, because they can't really, or they don't go to therapy, is because they can't really understand what it's like for someone else, especially if they violated their rights in some way. It's just really difficult, I think.
Mm-hmm. One thing that stuck out to me when I was reading the criteria is A3, impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. Because, I mean, honestly, and like, obviously you have to have at least 3 or more of the criteria, but like it speaks to, and we were talking about this before we hit record, we've talked about this before on the podcast, the overlap in symptoms between disorders. Because if I thought of impulsivity or plan to fail ahead, my first thought would probably be like ADHD or some type of executive functioning disorder. My assumption, and once again, I am not an expert, is how that impulsivity or failure to plan ahead presents in antisocial personality disorder probably appears different than somebody with ADHD hyperactive subtype, given the other traits that this individual would also have. But yeah, that stuck out to me.
It's interesting because every other trait and criteria there has to do with something interpersonal, like lack of responding to norms, deceitfulness, disregard for the safety of others, lacking remorse. Like it's all sort of like outward towards others, where it's like that one that you read was like the one that it's kind of not in some ways.
Yeah. And it's one that a lot of people can relate to.
Sure. Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I've never diagnosed ASPD, but I would assume if I were to diagnose, I would probably, even though like technically it only says 3, if one of the 3 was impulsivity, I would be looking to see if there's other ones as well. Well, yeah. I mean, I just feel like KB, I just said that could be something so many people relate to, or how their impulsivity shows. Are they impulsively like blurting out answers in class? Well, I guess if they're 18, in college, or are they impulsively harming others?
Sure.
For example, how does that impulsivity shows, which shows like the nuance that comes with our field.
Yeah. And as we do our research to prepare for these podcasts, which some of you would be surprised to know, we try to give you good information. Some of us try harder than others. I'm not going to point fingers or name names. But in one study I was reading, they were showing impaired regions in the brain with people with antisocial personality disorder, which in building compassion for all people and understanding that, yes, there's regions of the brain like the prefrontal cortex. This is where we need Barb in here to explain what the superior temporal gyrus is. But one region I did know, Barb's my mom, for those that don't know. Now,
That's what we should bring her on. We'll talk about it.
Well, I'll be like, what are these regions, Mom? I mentioned them. But another one that I did know was the amygdala hippocampal complex, which, of course, we know about fear, memory, and fear response. So it's interesting that that's firing differently. And also the anterior cingulate cortex. But anyways, more of the story.
All I'm hearing in my head is like, that's a big word for Elmo.
It really was. But when you think of it that way, and a lot of y'all know this, we know, especially in OCD, we see areas of the brain that are overactive. And we've seen that again. We know that in the amygdala with people with generalized anxiety disorder, it's overactive. But when you can think of it from that perspective, it gives a little bit, I think for some of us, it gives more understanding that the brain is complex and these regions and the way of relating is very different. And the way they're seen and experienced in the world in others is very different.
Oh, yeah.
So obviously we just went through the criteria, and all of us have said we've never or have very limited experience with antisocial personality disorder. When you all think of like the stereotypes of antisocial personality disorder, what kind of things come to mind?
Yeah, just serial killers. That's all they are.
Yeah.
I mean, That's it. They're just out there killing they're all out there killing people.
Just murking everybody. Yeah.
Yep.
I think one of the big stereotypes is that they just consistently get in trouble with the law. Like, and in the people that I've dealt with, obviously in forensics, yes, because that's probably one of the reasons why they're there. But I wonder how underdiagnosed it is because people aren't seeking services, So how do we really know like what other people's experiences are with any diagnosis really? But I would imagine that like, what if there are people out there who don't commit crimes, but they're, I don't know, doing other things that are weird or, don't comply with social norms. Who knows?
I was just going to say, or they're not complying to like they're not complying to laws, but they're not out committing murders.
Right.
So they might be engaging in unlawful behavior or those type of things, but they either haven't been caught or it's not to the point where it's just like those big ones.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar because the first criteria, when it talks about failure to conform to social norms, it says repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. Like, so you don't have to be caught and arrested. I am sure there are plenty of people out there who break the law relatively frequently and have never been caught doing so.
So they're just
or even if we think of but if we think of serial killers, like minus movies and stuff, a lot of people are serial killers because they don't get caught until they've killed X amount of people, if at all.
Yeah.
Because to be a serial killer, you have to kill multiple people over a period of time. So, I do wonder about like the diagnosis and how many people may actually be criteria, but are functioning in society.
Yeah, I think that's important to absorb. Is not everybody. If you kill someone, it doesn't mean you have antisocial personality disorder.
Totally.
Oh yeah,
like
absolutely.
Just there's a lot of reasons people kill other people. I'm not no means whatsoever justifying, but I think that can be out there of like.
Oh yeah.
If you kill a bunch of people, you have antisocial personality disorder. Not necessarily. And you don't need to be that extreme either to meet criteria after we just went through. But again, we're talking about it because that stereotype exists in movies and TV to the detriment.
And I think it's also important that just because you also break laws too,
correct,
doesn't like when you were saying that, I was like, I break the law every time I drive my car because I have a lead foot.
Right, that's a good example.
But you know what I mean? Like that doesn't like there's also that
we know we've ridden with you, KBI.
There's that nuance that's in there as well. That if I go and read that, right, breaks laws, impulsive. Well, shit, I'm 2 for 2. But the reality is I'm really not. Because if you actually look at those things, like the laws that I break are not significant.
Yeah.
Or a pervasive pattern of such,
that's
which
what
I think in personality disorders, that's what people need to hear. It's a long-term pervasive pattern. Any of us at different times can be deceitful or lying or, maybe do things to our advantage. You could argue that's sort of human behavior in spurts, but in a long pervasive pattern, when you're a psychologist, therapist out there, you're diagnosing, you're seeing this for the long haul and almost always in those teenage before 18 years. It's not something that just started for someone.
Exactly.
Totally. And even like a big life event usually won't cause something like this. It is like a pervasive pattern, not to say like the nature nurture debate when you're younger, who knows, in terms of genetic predisposition and all that. But I do think that like when I would evaluate people for this, I would give a lot of psychological testing, do all those things as well, just to like triple check. Cause it is a pretty heavy diagnosis, you know what I mean? To give somebody. Any personality disorder kind of is, if you think about it, cause you have to assess, developmentally for like their whole life, bring me back, and then you get collateral data from mom or dad just to kind of like really solidify it, because to Justin's point, it's a really like long-standing kind of like, I wouldn't even call it a worldview, just like a way of existing,
Yeah. And Justin, to piggyback on something you said, like per the criteria, you have to have symptoms or meet diagnostic criteria of conduct disorder before the age of 15. So if you're 24 and are experiencing or meet criteria for these symptoms, but never previously had this history of behavior problems in childhood or adolescence, technically you can't meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder and probably would be diagnosed with conduct disorder as an adult at that point, because it is that pervasive pattern from adolescence into adulthood, which is another reason we don't diagnose it till 18, because you have to see that pattern like across the lifespan, basically.
Yeah. A couple other research points I'll throw out there real quick, and then maybe we'll talk about like treatment. But one of them was the majority of children diagnosed with conduct disorder do not later meet conduct for antisocial personality disorder, which I think is important, because if you're a parent listening to this, you're out there, you're like, my child has conduct disorder, they're going to be antisocial. The odds are no, that they're not going to meet criteria later. However, in what we just said is, if as an adult you get diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, you need to meet criteria for conduct disorder when you're younger. But another quick thing real quick, because this was something I was reflecting on, I was like, what is the difference between antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder? And a cool study that I found was like kind of showing what are the key variable differences. And so within antisocial personality disorder, recklessness and impulsivity were sort of unique to antisocial, and grandiosity, attention seeking, and the need for admiration were unique to narcissistic personality disorder. But otherwise, the two can overlap a lot in terms of, at times, maybe manipulating, using people for their own benefit, and being sort of unforgiving. For what that's worth.
That was really well said. Yeah, because I do think like when people think about, I don't know, serial killers, like if that's a stereotype of antisocial personality disorder, like we were talking about before, like people with antisocial personality disorder don't necessarily need that spotlight of admiration. No. They could, both people with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial, have that lack of empathy and lack of remorse potentially, but it, like Jess's point, it'll look different. It might present differently in some sense.
Well, and Justin, I just appreciate you bringing that up, because I think, at least I'll speak from my perspective, especially as somebody that does not work with adults or works with very few adults in that emerging adulthood age. I feel like even for individuals who are trained in mental health, unless you specifically specialize in working with a certain personality disorder, understanding the nuanced differences between the different personality disorders can be extremely confusing. Cause like, we're learning about it in graduate school. We had to, first, us psychologists, memorize the differences for the EPPP, but like schizotypical versus schizoaffective, like all of those, if we're getting into different clusters. But yeah, I mean, I feel people know borderline personality disorder pretty well. I'm saying that loosely. But then the other ones, I think, as we talked about in our misconceptions episode, anything in the media and things like that just draw on these stereotypes. And that's what people run with. And we don't actually know the nuanced differences.
One other thing that I was thinking of was, I think Justin brought up substance use before. So when people are just say under the influence and they're just say they have no regard for the law or other people's rights or, whatever, when we're thinking about diagnosing antisocial, I think it's in the DSM as well. It can't happen only during periods of time when you're on a substance. Like, if you're just say, you're just drinking a little too much, or something like that, and you're breaking the law and doing all these things. I mean, that doesn't make you antisocial either, you know? And I think it's important for people to know that too, because I think they are comorbid, like substance use and antisocial, which is why differential diagnosis is like so important with it.
And that's really common with a lot of mental health diagnoses and substance use, that a lot of providers are very hesitant to even diagnose things like depression and anxiety while someone is maybe in active use, because it is very hard to see, like, what are the true symptoms that we are looking at here. So yeah, no, it's definitely difficult.
Yeah. I did think it was interesting that that there's a higher correlation in individuals who have antisocial personality disorder. I keep wanting to say anti-personality social disorder, which maybe will be a new disorder that comes out when we're in this long war with AI that is
So
coming.
what would that be? Anti-personality disorder?
It's
like, what would that criteria be, Justin?
It's when you lose having any sense of personality, but only within social disordered settings.
So AI bots, basically.
Yeah, that's why I was elaborating to this more with AI. But in individuals who experience abuse, trauma within their home, which we know is usually a predictor for a lot of different disorders, but if they had substance addicted, abusing parents, that it was a greater predictor for someone than having antisocial personality disorder, which is just interesting. It's interesting correlates and stuff to get curious about what might be going on if your parent abuses substances that would then, have a higher rate of the children having antisocial personality disorder.
So interesting. Do you guys know the treatments, or anybody familiar with them? Or
There's really not. I was trying to do research on this. We've already highlighted, like, these individuals typically don't seek treatment unless they're mandated. And really everything I found, like, there were some things that says, like, for some people, rewarding good behavior may help. That for some people, like, anger management skills may help. But really everything I found was talking about it's beneficial to treat the comorbidities. So treating the substance use. We didn't mention this, but people who experience childhood trauma, especially abuse, are more likely to develop antisocial personality disorder than those who don't. So if there's PTSD, like Justin, you already said, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, there's no medications for antisocial personality disorder. So when I was looking up research, it was like, you can medicate for comorbidities, but really there's not treatment for it. But with that being said, I did read something that basically said that behavior can definitely improve even if lack of empathy remains. And I wish I wrote down the citation, but read something that by age 40, a lot of individuals don't show. Did you see that too, Justin?
Yes.
A lot of
gets better with age.
Yes, basically it gets better with age. Don't show a lot of those outward, like, criminal behaviors that we would see. But yeah.
Yeah. The other things I had read were having steady employment and being married were significant moderating variables. AKA someone out there is like, yeah, being married makes it worse. No, it made it better, which is interesting, right? It's interesting to think about that they're moderating variables. So if someone's married, if someone holds steady employment, which, these things aren't shocking. If someone's feeling like they can support themselves and they do have someone that they're sort of connecting with, that's sort of, made sense to me as I read that. But also things that you would predict, like age of incarceration is a big predictor for severity. Of course, if someone is incarcerated earlier, it's not good.
I wonder too, like, obviously comparing apples and oranges, but with things like neurodivergence, there's a lot of masking with neurodivergence. And I wonder too, if, like, with antisocial personality, I wonder if there's also people out there who have just really learned to mask and taken their symptoms. And while, yes, a lot of those symptoms are, those criteria, like, for example, unlawful behavior, have learned to, okay, this gets me enough.
Right.
This fulfills enough. And it is like speeding 90 every time you go, I don't know. But like, like finding ways like to cope with that so that, they're not going to jail or they're not committing, more heinous crimes or things like that. So I wonder like if there are individuals out there who've just learned how to mask in a way.
I wonder too. And in my personal experience with at least the people that I know in my life, everything that you guys said rings true just from a personal perspective, like treating the comorbidities. And I do think, to KBI's point, I do wonder if there is a masking effect of some sort, and maybe not the traditional masking that we might see with neurodivergence, but like masking in terms of like, I mean, technically lying would be, putting something away, you know what I mean? But I do wonder if they're more like, as time goes on, more able to say, yeah, that doesn't really align, or yeah, I did lie about that. Or if they are able to kind of verbalize those things. And with behavioral therapy, we've seen that in correctional settings too, right. Which is great. I don't ever like to lose hope that there's not a treatment, for it, or that it can't get better over time. But people tend to, with antisocial, they tend to slow down too once they get older. They're like, oh, I just don't got the time anymore. I don't know if that's actually what they think, but the intensity of the symptoms like doesn't seem as intense as it was when they were younger, maybe. And I don't really know what that means, other than maybe they're just like, I'm getting old. I don't know,
Yeah. I also think about the fact, and I did read this, but also thinking into stereotypes, like individuals with antisocial personality disorder tend to be like intelligent and like charismatic individuals. So even if they lack remorse, lack empathy, if they are intelligent and charismatic, they can probably learn how to like fake it basically, or mirror those, this is a stereotype, but like I think of, Ted Bundy, like, or, like a lot of the serial killers, I know once again, that's a stereotype. They're alluring, charming, all of these things. Or KBI, to your point, like where is enough that I kind of get my thrill? So what does that impulsivity look like? Maybe as a younger individual, it was more impulsive harm, but as an older individual, it shows up in different ways. Or like the irritability and aggressiveness, physical fights or assaults, like, I don't know, learning to get that energy out in a different way. So that was a really good point, KPI.
Like my brain just thinks like, even as I got older, like, right, the impulsivity of being younger was really high. But then like, as you get older, like you become more calculated, you become more like, and so I wonder if it's also like, again, like as we get older, like does that shift into something that is more manageable? Like they're still engaging and they're still managing, like they're still dealing with those symptoms, but because they have an adult brain now, that just changes how it presents. Or I just think too, like, I wonder, like the individuals who have this disorder, like what kind of jobs are they holding? Like, are they also holding jobs that can kind of feed into this a little bit? Are they not? I don't know. Like, I just think of like what could possibly be like those
factors. Yeah, they all work on Wall Street, all of them, in corporate America.
Like CEOs of insurance
that was a joke,
companies.
But not really. Yeah,
I know. But like the CEOs.
Yeah, but I think there's ways to sort of use this contrarian, anti-society, antisocial, that again isn't just aggressiveness towards other, like physical aggressiveness. I think it's rule breaking comes in all forms, and there's plenty of ways to make money in doing that. But I agree with you, and I think of like the hormonal effect, but I also think just in general, people are able to learn consequences of behaviors. Yeah. And a lot of mandated therapy, a lot of that is that. It's like you might not be working on empathy building. That might be a path that is sort of not worthwhile to go down. But learning of, if you do these behaviors, these are the consequences. People are very capable of learning, new behavioral strategies that benefit them. It might not be easy, but I think to that capacity, like behavioral therapy can be effective. The only other thing I was going to say, I'm like 90% sure on this, and I was hesitant to say it, but I thought I've heard that with borderline personality disorder as well, that throughout age, symptoms tend to become less severe.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I thought that was a thing.
A lot of like ADHD is another one that, as I know it's not on the same, like it's not a personality disorder, but as you get older, what the research shows is like impulsive symptoms tend to lessen, and it presents more as inattentive. So I don't know the research on that, but it is interesting to think that there are certain disorders that with time, the symptoms are less prevalent. So that would be interesting to,
you know what I wonder too, and I don't know if this is validated by research. It's just like a thought I had, but I'm thinking with personality disorders, like most people who get diagnosed with a personality disorder have had struggles, like a ton of struggles in their life, a lot of obstacles, a lot of trauma, potentially. And I think like if somebody's kind of had a life like that, you almost have to empathize with the fact that it might take a really long time for you to kind of work through that stuff. You know what I mean? Or like figure out where you are supposed to be in the world and stuff like that. And like, as you age, maybe you just get better at getting introspective. I don't know. Maybe you just get better at thinking about your childhood, or I don't know. I would like to believe that, Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows?
There's always something that we do know.
That's a good one.
No.
And it's the Google Scholar Shorts.
We know
research.
That we're going to know more through research. Thank God the theme music's already playing, and people are like, just stop. Just let it happen.
So sad.
Okay. Well, Justin, you actually set me up good with some of the research that you talked about. So my question I'm going to pose to you all, how do you think amygdala activation is different in the brains of those with antisocial personality disorder compared to healthy controls when it comes to reacting to different emotional faces? So the ones in this study were happy, fearful, and angry. I'll give you that.
Deregulated, downregulated, meaning less activity.
Okay.
Then sort of a control. I would expect more.
Yeah, it's compared to a control.
Yeah.
I was thinking then, and I keep thinking about like the mediating empathy part of like, are you actually in touch with I'm getting ahead of myself. I agree with Justin. Yeah.
Okay. So compared to healthy controls, individuals with ASPD were worse at classifying happy and fearful faces, while performances between groups did not differ for angry faces.
Oh, wow.
Individuals with ASPD showed stronger right amygdala activation for angry versus fearful faces, but no significant differences between angry and happy or fearful and happy faces. In the control group, happy faces resulted in stronger right amygdala activation than fearful and angry faces. And there was no difference between fearful and angry faces. So basically, I know that was a lot of words. Angry faces had the most activation in individuals with antisocial personality disorder. And then I'm going to I didn't have a question for this, but the researchers of this study were interested in investigating the effects of oxytocin on amygdala and behavioral responses in individuals with ASPD compared to their healthy volunteers. So participants received an intranasal dose of synthetic oxytocin or placebo. And researchers found for the right amygdala, the ASPD group showed a higher activation than control group when angry faces were shown under placebo. However, under oxytocin, the ASPD group had lower activation than the healthy control group at presentation of fearful, angry, and happy faces. And then oxytocin affected women in both groups more than men. So data from the study showed that oxytocin has a specific effect on anger-related amygdala activity in ASPD, and specifically women. So therefore, it's going back to treatments. Individuals could potentially benefit from oxytocin in the treatment of reactive aggression in ASPD.
So what you're saying is Voldemort just needed some love.
Oh my God.
Or
Yes,
oxytocin.
actually, the last sentence of this research study.
It's a love chemical. Isn't that what oxytocin is?
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that.
I think that's cool. I think that's cool. Like
That is like,
my mind is blown.
my mind is blown too, because I keep thinking about like, I think I just keep reflecting on my personal experiences with the people that I know. And I'm like, oh my God, like all of this kind of like the puzzle pieces just fit together a little bit of like, wow. And then I'm wondering developmentally when you're in utero or like, not even in utero, like your younger stages of life, if just say there was a lot of substance use, I know that there was something like that in the research where like your childhood was abusive or chaotic. I do wonder about like the love part of it, maybe not oxytocin, but I would, whatever. I'm just thinking about love and how, and connection and how that might mediate things differently for people in general. And then for those with antisocial, I'm like, did you just need more love? I'm kidding. It's probably not going to do it, but.
To some degree, it makes sense of why you would like over recognize or over activate to angry faces, like from an adaptive standpoint, because that could be threatening. But going off of what the two of you just said, is like if you grow up in a home where there's a lot of threats, you're going to connect with that quickly and need to. And you read a lot of the symptoms that we just said about, antisocial personality disorder. There's a lot of leaning forward and sort of leaning into people in different ways and sort of gaining control. So it's all interesting. I'm very fascinated by it, especially that there weren't differences in the others.
Yeah.
It was only with anger. That surprised
anger.
and fascinated with me. Yeah.
Well, and Justin, you said that things like marriage help to lessen symptoms.
It's interesting. I know. Look at that. Look at this.
Look at me connecting the dots.
All the pieces are puzzled. That's why you listen to this podcast, solving the world's problems. Someone's
Just need a little more oxytocin.
That's it. Someone's going to be like, I'm just going to go hug every person. And just
It's a protective factor, maybe. We don't know. We have no idea.
KBI's face changed.
Yeah, KBI's like,
on the hugging. It was like,
gotta give you psychological testing, KBI. Anyways, let's do the polls.
You'll get all the hugs soon.
Justin's favorite part.
all of them. The worst part of this
is
podcast.
the most perfect part of the podcast.
This is
Lord help me.
all right.
Help me.
I'm not going to take this for more, Justin. So all of these questions Justin created in his downtime because he loves the polls so much. So he helped me this week. I'm kidding. He hates it so much.
And I bet you that it's going to be perfect.
I love the polls. You listeners hate it. So we're just on opposite poles of the polls.
We're going to make this quick and easy. So I said, tell us what you know about antisocial personality disorder.
Ooh.
Most people said, no idea. But a lot of people said, is it hating being around / interacting with people? Mm-hmm. So to KBI's point before of like, somebody said it's characterized by lack of empathy.
Mm-hmm. Good job.
It's entirely different from what most people mean when they call someone antisocial.
Mm-hmm.
Part of cluster B personality disorders, what people mean when they say, quote, psychopath, end quote. Interesting. Most people said that same word. I usually don't say it because I almost feel like it's derogatory, but most people have no idea. Okay, so great. We got a mixed bag. So I said antisocial personality disorder is part of what cluster? A, B, C, or I don't know. I'm just here for the results. What do you guys think?
B, right? Now that I said that so confidently, I'm questioning myself. I was like, it's B. It's B though, right? I closed my DSM.
Yeah. Okay. The correct answer is B, but our group members said, I don't know, I'm just here for the results.
There we go.
That was 47%. Okay. The 12-month prevalence rate for antisocial personality disorder is around blank percent of the U.S. population. 1, 2, 3, or 17%.
3.
It's interesting because technically I found resources that alluded to 1, and then I also found resources that alluded to 3, and I found more resources that alluded to 3. So I'm just going to go with 3.
What does the DSM say?
I want to know what the DSM says.
I'll pull it up again. You keep going, and I'll go.
Okay. Conduct disorder always leads to a diagnosis of antisocial. True or false?
False.
Yeah, 95%. Okay, which is not a notable feature of antisocial personality disorder. So I have a couple of the criteria up here: failure to conform to social norms, reckless disregard for the safety of others, periods of depression and anxiety, or lack of remorse. And all of our group members got it. It was or periods of depression and anxiety. 56%. And that was it, friends. Thank you.
So the DSM says, so in the National Comorbidity Survey replication, the prevalence was 0.6%. But in the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, it was 3.6%. A review of 7 epidemiological studies, 6 of which were in the United States, found a median prevalence of 3.6%. So it sounds like we're on 3. But a fun fact, highest prevalence of antisocial personality disorder, which was greater than 70%, is among samples of men with the most severe alcohol use disorders and from substance abuse clinics, prisons, or other forensic settings.
Yeah.
The setting mattered. Yeah.
Yeah. Setting absolutely matters. So 3. Yeah, I would say. So
we're going with 3, folks. Cool. I love how curious we are this episode. We're like, we think it might be this. We're not sure. Let's research it.
Know what else we're curious about? The group member questions. Thank you all for submitting. As always, we got a variety of questions this week. So the first one I want to start with, I think highlights kind of what you were saying, K10, with the responses of like, is it when people don't want to hang out with one another? And KBI, what you were saying. So it's Anonymous from Anonymous asks, what is the difference between antisocial personality disorder and social anxiety? Love the podcast and knowledge that you impart. So I don't feel like we necessarily have to go. We talked about antisocial personality disorder already and go through the criteria again, but we could talk about social anxiety and maybe like why people get these confused.
Yeah, social anxiety is having a fear and often a self-judgment in social situations. Like you're worried people are judging you, that they're going to critique you harshly. So often you avoid social situations. But again, I hope some of the main differences you're landing on here is if you have social anxiety, there's often a desire to socialize and you want to maybe have friends or interact, but this fear, might be coming over you that you avoid certain situations. But there's not this pervasive sort of undertone of either manipulating, having a lack of remorse, or sort of understanding or connecting with. It's just this anxiety, this fear that makes you sort of maybe hesitant to interact with others. And someone with antisocial personality disorder might not be hesitant to interact with others at all, but they might have a lack of empathy towards them. They might be deceitful towards them, and they might manipulate them, or do things that cause harm to another person, where in social anxiety, that's not a part of the pattern.
Well, and I think it's so unfortunate how similar the names are, because antisocial isn't like that makes sense for someone who doesn't want to be in social situations. Like it makes like the words make sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like I don't want to be here. I'm anti this. But the problem is that, because it's laced with antisocial personality disorder, a lot of times people will say, oh, I have like an antisocial personality. I'm like, ma'am, no, you don't. No, you don't. And it's mostly because they don't actually like in our polls, I don't think many people know that diagnosis actually exists. I think that they think it's sociopathy or psychopathy. Like that's what they think is the term for that versus that the diagnosis is antisocial personality disorder. And I think like it's a little bit different than I brought this up before, like intrusive and impulsive thoughts, because there's 2 different words for those. Yes, people use them interchangeably, but there's 2 different words. The problem with this is that I feel like there's not 2 different words for it.
There is. It's asocial, it sounds so similar. Asocial means you don't want to socialize, but asocial and antisocial, just like impulsive and intrusive sounds super similar. But also kind of like we talked about on our side session, like we don't usually talk about impulsive thoughts. We talk about intrusive. Most people aren't going to say, I'm feeling asocial. They're going to default to say, I feel antisocial. Because
absolutely.
Yeah. I'm like, exactly like you said, it makes sense. You're I'm against socializing tonight or whenever. Or I feel antisocial. Like I'm against social. I don't want to go out with my friends. I feel so antisocial. Technically it's asocial, but nobody uses that term. Like I've never used that term, I don't think. Sorry, I cut you off, KBI.
No, but I just think like that's the hardest part is like, is it so similar and it feels like a normal use of it. And because people lack that other education on the other side, like if someone says I'm antisocial, I don't usually correct them. It's usually when they say like, oh, my personality is so antisocial. I'm like, meh.
Sure. Sure.
Let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah.
Because it makes it, like you had said before, it becomes very somatic and or semantics, where people think they're using a word in a type of way to describe something. In reality, it's not quite it.
Okay, so the next questions, we get two that are similar. So Max from Iowa and then Annie from Germany. Or Ani. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Ani. So Max says, how does real life ASPD compare to depictions of, quote, psychopaths on TV and movies? And then Ani from Germany asked, do you know any movie shows or characters that portray antisocial personality disorder correctly? I feel like we're flashing back to our like TV and movie episode. I mean, I feel like we already hit on the fact that when we asked about stereotypes that we all thought of like serial killers. And so I feel like that's how they're mostly depicted in TV and film, because you're not going to probably make a movie about the person with antisocial that's on Wall Street and is successful. You might, but you're probably going to make it about Wolf of Wall Street.
Joke. I don't know. I'm not diagnosing him, but
people like entertainment. I don't know. That's just my initial gut reaction.
Yeah. Whenever I would watch, you guys know I was like really into true crime for a really long time and had to stop watching it. I needed to take a break. But whenever I would watch true crime, or even not even true crime, just like those documentaries about serial killers, I would always think like, do they have antisocial or not? You know what I mean? And usually my vibe was like, maybe, who knows, potentially, perhaps, you know, I don't really know. But I can't think of anything other than like a crime oriented documentary or TV series or movie that would depict it. I'm like struggling to come up with that.
I hate naming a real life person because we never know, but I am watching the John Gotti, you know, the mobster from up in New York series on Netflix. It's very fascinating. But I think similarly, when you have stuff like this of people controlling the mafia and the hits that go on, the interviews that go on, the way people describe situations, sort of a matter of fact for just having to do a job, and they like did some really harmful things. It makes you wonder. But I think those are some of the things that come to mind, is like people who just willingly and sort of like non-emotionally can carry out acts that are against others just really easily. Without remorse. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Does it have to be to that extreme? Of course not. Is that what we see depicted a lot? Because extremes of everything. Think of the reality TV shows you watch. It's the extreme of dating. It's the extreme of this. Yeah. It's what gets on TV. It's what gets on the news. It's what makes a movie. Because if it's not the extreme, people aren't going to waste their investment production dollars on it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
Yeah. The only like movie that really comes to mind with antisocial personality disorder is Silence of the Lambs with Hannibal Lecter, which is an extreme depiction. But I would say also when you're talking about like correctly or accurately, like he in the film is a psychiatrist. So it does show the side of like, you can get through like medical school, all these things, hold a job and be a murderer that like eats people. But you know, but like, I think, I mean, and it's still for entertainment purposes, but I do think that does show like a more like humanistic side in the sense of like, you can have a successful career and be charming in those things. But this is definitely not an area of expertise when reflecting on movies.
Yeah.
I do think that's a good point that needs to be emphasized, though, that if you're listening to this, when we do an episode fully on a disorder, we can all really get harnessed and locked into the disorder. But I hope no one forgets there can be plenty of positive, interesting, successful other qualities. And it's not to say every person with antisocial personality disorders X, Y, or Z, but these are the symptom criterias. If you're going to get the diagnosis, you at least have to check these boxes. Otherwise, it's technically not it. But also, there are plenty of other complex aspects to being a human with any sort of disorder. Just to have that resonate in your brain.
No, it's true. And I think in my experience, like there's so much psychological testing that would have to be done in order for me to feel comfortable giving that diagnosis, only because like, you know, we get diagnosed from a clinical interview, of course, but I do think you really have to look at the pervasiveness and all of that stuff. So Justin, I agree with you.
So the next question is kind of building off of that, but this is from Anonymous. Why do you think there is such a negative connotation to antisocial personality disorder? And how do you think the way TV series portray APD affects wider public's understanding of it?
I think because a lot of the things that get attention are the unhelpful or maladaptive experiences that people have who have antisocial. I mean, the things that you see are the reckless disregard or the unlawful behavior or the pervasive pattern of not being able to hold a job for your whole life or something like that. I mean, I don't really know many people that talk about it in a positive light, which I could see both sides of that too, because I think KBI, I want to hear your thoughts too, because I think we talked a little bit about how some traits could be adaptive, but I think people with antisocial, if I could really think about this, like they were probably trying really hard to survive their upbringing. I mean, at least when I think about the people that I know personally who have it, like I can't imagine what it was like, you know? So I do think that like having a little bit of compassion for that, but then you have to think about the people who do commit those big crimes. It's like, it's kind of a struggle, you know, sometimes to have empathy for that, you know, but at the end of the day, I do think it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, I think it's just a product of the diagnosis of like, it is doing negative damage to other people.
Yeah.
Like you can go through those 7 criteria at your will and pick any random 3. It's going to have a negative connotation on others. So I think that's why it does sort of carry this negative connotation. And yet it doesn't take away from everything that K10 just said of we stay curious about what causes this development. Why does it happen? How is trauma involved? What brain areas are firing? Like you should always treat people as people. But I think to meet criteria for a disorder, you're sort of moving against others and even harming others in a lot of instances. It's why it's going to carry a negative connotation.
Another thought I just had, and reflecting back on, I think it was our like maybe misconceptions episode or media portrayal episodes. And we talk a lot on this podcast about people sharing their lived experience, like on social media, talking about things. I have never seen somebody on social media talking about having antisocial personality disorder. Now, there's probably people out there, but like compared to like autism, ADHD, you know, other disorders. And so if the only way people are getting information, unless they are clinicians, is from Silence of the Lambs or from these like crime docuseries of serial killers, like absolutely it would just perpetuate that negative connotation because there's no information to counter it. And to everything you said, Justin, like innately the traits are doing harm to others. But I think there's not also like a humanized side of it because people aren't sharing their lived experience. Because I think, it might not change the perception totally, but if, a bunch of successful, I don't know, people holding high profile jobs talked about, hey, I have this and these are all the things I've achieved in my life. I'm married, I have kids, like all of those things. I feel like that would at least soften the perception of it. It may not change the public's perception, but I don't know. Have any of you came across anybody like openly talking on social media, YouTube about?
No.
I see people narcissism, but not antisocial.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Even think like with narcissism, there's like, for some reason, I think when I compare the two, antisocial it just feels heavier. I mean, narcissism it's a heavy diagnosis too. It's
sure.
You know what I mean? But I don't know. I just feel like with antisocial, it's like, there's just that extra layer, for some reason. So maybe those people don't feel compelled to talk about it, or maybe they're not formally diagnosed because how would they be if they're not engaging with treatment or something, or who knows?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, Caitlin from California and Joe from Iowa, both had questions related to something KBI brought up about like the positive qualities. So Caitlin asks, what qualities of antisocial personality disorder could be beneficial if it doesn't cause distress impairments, or how might someone with antisocial personality disorder thrive in society? And then Joe asks, can antisocial personality be used for good at all? I've only ever seen it talked about in bad ways, like serial killers.
I really like how Caitlin posed it. You posed it fine too, Joe. So don't hang your head low, Joe. Pick it up. But I like how Caitlin posed it of, are there any qualities that might not cause distress impairment to others that might be seen as good? And that I agree with almost any disorder. Because I know I go on my soapbox a lot of like, oh, anxiety is good. And I watched the whole video on that. I'm like, oh, I don't agree with you. But I will always agree. There are qualities of anything, where the disorder overall is a disorder for a reason, but a quality of something like hypervigilance in itself, which we've already talked about, can be a protective thing in some capacities. But the quality of that I think of for antisocial is being contrarian, meaning sort of against societal norm of what is typical. I think being contrarian can be a huge asset in a lot of things, because as society goes, a lot of times we go in dumbass directions. Some of y'all are like, yes, I know this. But in actuality, we go in directions where like, this is stupid. But because of groupthink and many other things of like, don't step on people's toes, we do that. So I think I can totally see being more contrarian, be like against the norm, not in societal norms is one of the qualities we think about with antisocial. Certainly that can be beneficial at times.
Oh yeah. I even think, people with antisocial might also be really good business people. They might really, if you really think about it, I mean, they might, and again, I'm not talking from like my own personal experience because I don't know what it feels like, but I would imagine, that the chatter of like other people's emotions and other people's thoughts and feelings, like you almost like someone have a privilege of not having to even acknowledge any of that because you're not really focused on it because you can't empathize with it. So why think about it? Maybe, I don't know. I'm again hypothesizing because I don't know. And then you could really just focus on the goal of like, I want to make more money, or I want to like whatever that is. So I could see it being an asset. And then I would wonder, when you're in a position of power like that with a diagnosis like that, I do wonder if you would be good at business, but you wouldn't really be good with business for people. You know what I mean? So I guess it would depend on the setting too.
Yeah. So I know we talked about her before we started recording, but Dr. Lena Haji is a forensic psychologist, and I heard her on my podcast, and she focuses on psychopathy and things like that. And she talked about this concept of like psychopaths hiding in plain sight. So these are like the white collar criminals, the CEOs, politicians, like people that are very successful. And kind of going back to KBI, something you said of like, where's that, like the edge that they like, okay, I'm going to take it this far. So just like K10, you were saying, I think the traits can get people far in life. And, you know, whether we agree with how they get there, because, you know, white collar criminals are still criminals. But yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely ways these, you know, qualities could be beneficial, and definitely don't cause distress impairment to the individual. It might still cause distress or impairment to others. But I thought that was an interesting concept, and I wanted to give her a shout out because she taught me a lot.
She's great. She talks about it all the time on Instagram too. I would give her a follow. She's great. Yeah.
Well, and I think that just goes into like I had said earlier, like, have people out there figured out ways to take these symptoms and these criterion to be more societally acceptable, right? White collar crime is still a crime, but it seems to be more accepted than things like murder or assault or things like that. Still a crime, but it's looked at differently in a way. And so I wonder, like, again, like you said, these politicians, these major like, I'd be so interested to kind of ever dive into their brains to see, like, are there people up there who do meet criteria? Because, like, I think of, you know, some of the decisions that get made in these businesses, in these politics and things like that. And I'm like, I don't know how you sleep at night.
Yeah.
My jaded self, when you were KBI, were like, white collar crime might not like be viewed as bad. I'm like, is it not viewed as bad, or is it because these people are usually powerful and rich and have good lawyers and can get away with it?
Yes, but absolutely. There is that.
Or like don't get caught, have people with connections and things like that. But no, I mean, it is an interesting concept. So Sophie from Germany asks, is there a relationship with trauma and antisocial personality disorder? And I know we kind of touched on some of the causes, but wanted to allow us to have this discussion. Yes.
Yeah. There is indeed. Which, again, I hope gets people curious about the onset, because the answers that we know is always environment, genes, experience, interaction, which is true for almost anything. But the complexity of those is where we think about intervention, even from young ages, of early life trauma being a predictor for antisocial personality disorder later should intrigue you. It should make you want to do something about that, think about that. If you're a parent, certainly consider things going on in your home. But when we talk about intervention points, the time is now. There's always something to be done or get curious about, again, especially with children.
Yeah. And I mean, I know, Justin, you already highlighted this, but you know, if you grow up in a home with a parent who has substance abuse, also if you have a parent that has antisocial personality disorder, high risk, but then you can look at that like face value of substance abuse. And I'm not saying everybody with substance abuse obviously causes any type of other like physical abuse, but there's probably going to be trauma having a parent with substance abuse, just like there's going to be trauma, you know, having a parent with antisocial personality disorder. Not necessarily, but if we're conceptualizing that, and I mean, from what I looked up, that was a lot of correlate, but exactly like you said, it's genes, environment, interaction, but trauma seems to be a big contributor. So Anonymous from Ohio
OH.
asked a really good question.
I know it.
Is there really a difference between waiting to diagnose someone until 18? For example, someone 17 years old who has met all the criteria for this diagnosis, will waiting another year really make a difference? Justin is having a very strong reaction right now.
I read this beforehand and I was like, Anonymous, I love you. Like I do. Because these are the questions, listen, you don't have to be in our field to have wondered this. Like, what if you only meet 2 criteria for antisocial personality? What if you only meet 3 criteria for another thing, but you're supposed to have 4? Yeah. What if there's 17 and a half? Listen, I get it. And if anybody tells you otherwise, you need to tell them they're lying. There is subjectivity within this field. And a lot of things that you're like, what's the difference between a 17 and 18-year-old? Good question. I love that you ask it.
One's considered a child and one's considered an adult. That's what they're going to say. But I agree. Like, what really is the difference?
And now that we know about brain development, and some people are saying adulthood should really only be considered 25 and beyond. But it's so funny because laws are written in a way. There's a lot of things you quote gain at 18. It's all fascinating and it's all very subjective.
Yeah. If I had to and I totally agree, Anonymous. Like, that's why I love this question, because I think about that so often with so many of the personality disorders. But if I'm defending the DSM for a second, which I rarely do, because I think there's so many.
I want to hear this.
This is so rare for any psychologist, I feel like.
So I know, but when we're looking at, I read the criteria, but then if you're reading the DSM, there's all this other information. It's that pervasive pattern from childhood into adulthood. So I would argue for antisocial as compared to others, since that is part of the criteria. You need to see that pervasive pattern. And to KBI's point, at 18, you're suddenly an adult. So is there actually a difference? No. But I would be interested, because in some countries, 17 is a legal adult. So
yeah.
But I wonder what it says in the ICD-10, because other countries don't necessarily use the DSM. But I would argue that's probably why, because that is part of the conceptualization of it, is that persistent pattern from childhood or adolescence into adulthood. But in reality, there is nothing different. If you are 17 years old and 364 days, nothing is miraculously going to change when you wake up the next morning.
Yeah.
And to the question of will another year really make a difference? Probably not, unless maybe the conduct type behavior was actually due to something else that was missed. I don't know. I'm just trying to think when it could be different, but yeah, I don't know.
And then I'm thinking too, and this might sound silly, but I'm just going to say it. But when you think about personality disorders and how they're chronic, pervasive over time, I even think too, at 17 or 18, do you really know who you are? You know what I mean? I think to Jess's point, I agree with that point of it has to be present during the younger developmental years, maybe. And then to see the progression, I could understand the progression of it, but maybe they just threw it in there. Some people were just getting willy nilly with it and they were just diagnosing people at 15 or something.
Yeah.
And they had to make some marker. I don't know, but it does feel weird to have between 17 and 18, because there isn't much of a difference in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not to put you all on the spot or derail too much, but if you just went with your gut right now and you had to pick an age, at what age did you feel like an adult? No wrong answers.
30, to be honest with you.
I was going to say 30.
I was going to say 27 was when I was going to
28.
Yeah. Okay. And someone else might feel different, but
yeah,
I thought that's just, you have these moments in life where you're now I feel like an adult. And at least all of us were late 20s or beyond.
Yeah.
That's so true. I hadn't thought about it that way.
And I will say, I think for me, part of it was being in grad school until 28.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that, but then I also think like I got married at 24, which is like a very adult thing to do. But like even being married at 24 didn't make me suddenly an adult. Yeah, it was definitely like, it was after fellowship, after I was like fully licensed in my job for like over a year. And I was like, okay, now I can adult.
Yeah.
It was when I was standing in Walmart trying to decide what was the perfect vacuum to buy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Ain't nothing.
And getting into significant discourse over the vacuum.
How much does the battery life factor in? How much suction power do you want? Like, are you really going to spend $600 on a vacuum?
Or when you get excited to get an Instapot for Christmas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's when you know you're peaking in adulthood is like, shit. I went out on Black Friday and bought an air fryer. I didn't just buy one, I bought two. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I agree with all that. I feel like I'll like go and buy an appliance just to feel something now. You know what I mean? It's just like, I don't know. Maybe it's just
A couple weeks ago, weren't you buying like seltzer water? Like I'm buying sparkling water to feel something. This week it's an
I
appliance.
was. I know I do that all the time because it's better than just getting hammered. You know what I mean? But like, yeah, it's definitely more adaptive now because at like 20, a hangover was like a half a day. Now it's like a week. I can't do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lord knows.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we have to change the adult age to 30 or 28, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I was actually, it would be interesting, like, if they changed it to like, you can't get diagnosed until 25, like when your frontal lobe is fully
That would be
developed.
nice. Yeah.
Or even like
rent
21.
a car before 25.
Yeah. I know. I think about that a lot, like that age. And we did a whole episode on emerging adulthood, but like 18 to 25, the law says you're an adult, but you're not really.
There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. You don't know what the hell. You don't know what.
Go hang out with a 22-year-old and tell me. You go hang out with a 22-year-old. You ask, then tell me. And again, there's variation, y'all. There's some 22-year-olds out there who are very adulting.
Trauma.
But off the average, when I'm chilling with a 22-year-old talking to a 22-year-old, I'm like, yeah, I'm old.
I'm not just old. I am old as hell. Like, yeah.
Absolutely.
Different.
So I actually don't even know if we touched on this. So I just want to make sure Sarah's question is answered. Are there gender differences?
3 times more likely in men.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Anonymous. It's 3 times more likely in men.
But like my brain goes, but is it?
Oh.
Because women, it shows differently in women, kind of like ADHD or a lot of other
Or
like
borderline.
Yeah. And so I wonder, like, is it just showing differently
Could.
in that?
Maybe.
Or are males more likely to do the things like serial kill? That was not the proper English of that. Are they more likely to be serial killers than women? And maybe women show more of those, like, I don't know, white collar crime.
Yeah.
Manipulation.
Like that kind of stuff. But then is that flagged as a different personality disorder?
Could be. Again.
Yeah. Because then I think about like the population, like the correctional facilities, like, you know, and who's diagnosed with it. You know what I mean? And I think that is kind of like part of that stereotype of like committing crimes and like all that stuff. But at the end of the day, I mean, I don't see many women serial killers. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I have no idea. Yeah. Interesting.
Because we're too smart.
There's no research to support that people with antisocial in men are less intelligent. Let me just throw that out there. I mean, at least not that I know of.
No.
KPI.
She was saying I
just think of like the memes that like joke like women know how to get blood out of things. So it's like, it just makes me.
True.
She's also, Taylor Swift has a song about like murdering a husband or helping murdering a husband. That's what she's saying about.
So did the Dixie Chicks.
Yeah, the Dixie
Bye, Earl.
Yep. Anyways, so Anonymous asks, how can I best support my partner who has antisocial personality disorder?
First, have them thank you because you're mediating some of that. Statistically, according to research, so you look them in the eye and be like, you need to offer me a thank you because I listened to the Welcome to Group Therapy pod, and having a partner, I guess technically it says being married, but maybe you're married, maybe you're not. But I think honestly, gaining information, understanding, I think especially with personality disorders, that if someone is going to make shifts, there's no way that they can do that if they don't recognize their pattern of behavior.
Yeah.
I think that's the hard part. It's like if someone can't recognize the pattern of behavior or doesn't believe it, it's hard. It's very hard to sort of make any shifts. And I know you said support, but I'm wondering where they're showing distress, because theoretically, there's no criteria that is like blatant distress of the individual. It's outward, as we discussed. So it's an interesting question that you pose.
I like your thoughts on that, because my first thought wasn't necessarily about the support either. It was like expectation management for Anonymous, you know, if you're expecting your partner to, really empathize and really understand where you're coming from, or really have a sense of remorse if they've hurt you. I mean, it might take some time for them to become aware of that. If they are in treatment, in my opinion, it might take more than just a couple of therapy sessions. You know what I mean? So it really just depends. But I think really the question, if I really want to answer it, I'm more inclined to want to support Anonymous and like, hey, expectation management and, anger management classes have been found to be somewhat helpful, for people with antisocial personality disorder, but it depends on if they're doing it in a court-ordered way. I know my forensic experience is coloring this right now, but like in a court-ordered way, or if they're doing it because they truly are like inquisitive and curious about changing their behavior. So it really depends, I think.
Yeah. The only things I would add, my thoughts kind of went back to what we were talking about earlier with treatment. Like, are there comorbidities that are impacting their life? Is there substance abuse?
Right.
Like, because those might be quote unquote easier arenas to support in. Or if you're thinking from a more like strict behavioral standpoint, like, rewarding, praising those like positive behaviors that you see. And I mean, like, I don't want to say everybody likes praise, because not everybody does, but like we all like to, or most of us do appreciate when we do something and, our partner recognizes it or our friends recognize it. So, I mean, those are small things that you can do, but I'm kind of with K10. Like, I want to make sure you're also supporting yourself in this process, as well. So Matt from the USA says, I hear ASPD connected with I always mess up this word, psychopathy. I know. I'm like, it's psychopathy. No, it's not. Psychopathy and sociopathy. So did I say that right this time? I don't know. All the time.
I can't say it a lot. I can't say that.
Yeah, sociopathy. Is it related to both? Just one? Does anybody know?
I think our forensic psychologist friends might know more. My understanding, and I could be completely wrong, so please don't take what I say as like the truth, but I'm pretty sure that psychopathy is the one that's associated. Lena would know more about this. Is more associated. Sociopathy, or however you say it. I think that might be like a pop psychology term. I don't know if that's actually like a term that's used, or if it's used like in crime documentaries, or if it's like an older term that may have been like outdated. Again, I'm just throwing stuff out there. I don't really know for sure.
So I saw this question. So I went back to my podcast episode with Lena. And so what she told me, like sociopathy is not actually a thing. So there used to be this like, a sociopath is someone that like their nurture made them that way. And a psychopath is somebody that like was just born that way. But we know from research that it's gene environment interaction with everything. So at least from Dr. Lena's perspective, like you said, it's kind of like a pop psychology term. And then a psychopath, quote unquote, is just kind of like layman's term for antisocial personality disorder. Not the same thing at all, but the comparison that comes to mind is like when people talk about dyslexia, that's not like a diagnostic clinical term. It's like learning disability in reading or specific learning disability in reading. But like people kind of know what you mean when you say dyslexia. People have an idea of what it means to be a psychopath, but it's just, I think her direct quote in the podcast interview I did with her was a dumbed down ASPD. So it's just like, it's all the same traits and things like that. But yeah, it's not like like you don't get diagnosed as a psychopath.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question. So Pax from Cali says, what is the hardest part about treating someone with it? And I know none of us have great clinical experience, but what would you all think would be the hardest part?
I think it would probably be just the limited interventions that are out there.
Yeah.
And just that barrier to treatment. And really you're kind of treating everything on the outside to hopefully get to the middle, but there's nothing really to treat like the middle of it.
Like the core. Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, just when I went into forensics, I thought it was going to be like there forever. I thought it was like going to be my thing. I was like so excited. As everybody knows, I love crime and true crime and all that stuff. I literally lasted just a couple of months. And I think it was mostly not because I don't have thick skin, because I think I do. I think it's more like it was hard for me to wrap my head around treating someone who's done such like heinous things to other people. It was just hard for me to kind of like compartmentalize in a way that I felt like I could not be objective. Like I just couldn't. So for me personally, I can't do it, with that. And not to say every person who has antisocial will commit like heinous crimes. It's just the setting I worked in at the time. But I would even notice, like, even just being in the room with someone like that, not that I was scared, but I felt like, how are we going to connect? You know what I mean? Like, I just felt like such a deep disconnection. So I felt like I wasn't effective and I just couldn't do it. It's not for everybody, I guess.
Another thing that comes to mind, and I don't know if this would be the hardest, because KB, I completely agree with you, the limited interventions, but K10, you've brought up a couple of times, like the difference, are they mandated to be in treatment versus are they going? And I have limited experience of working with individuals who are mandated to be in treatment, but when I was in graduate school, I worked for a community mental health and there was a lot of like DSS involvement. So I did work with adults that were mandated to be in therapy as part of their treatment plan to get their kids back. And at least in my experience, it was just a very different feeling than people that are coming to treatment willingly. And for me, it was really hard. And at the time I wasn't a parent or anything like that. Just like, and it also could have been imposter syndrome because I was still in graduate school, but like, and I've definitely had people that, were trying really hard and wanted to be there. But in my experience, there's just a different feeling when somebody is forced to be in treatment. And, they're not there because they want to be, they have their goals, they're forced to be. And personally, I don't believe that's a good setup for anyone. Like if I'm forced to do something, I'm not going to want to engage if I don't want to do it. So I think that would be hard. If they were forced. I'm not saying everybody is, but if they were.
Yeah.
Well, friends, peoples, of all places, maybe finishing up all their Halloween candy, we appreciate you being here with us, talking about these interesting topics. We leave you with a reflection question as we normally do. We always love to hear what you learned, what you gathered.